Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world with self-care strategies from Chinese medicine. I'm your host, Brody Welch, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Brody Welch, and today we're going to be talking about pain, what it is, what it isn't, and what we can do about it. My guest today is Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, who's a specialist and an expert in the science of pain. Dr. Cuccaro frequently speaks on pain and related topics to physicians and the public and works with health systems on chronic pain and opioids. Dr. Cuccaro's passion, though, is empowering others to master rather than manage pain. And in service of this, he's created and delivered several highly rated pain training programs to diverse audiences and has personally trained over 200 clinicians in modern pain science. His most recent project is a 1.5-hour on-demand pain module for clinicians available at www.thepainclass.com. Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, welcome to A Healthy Curiosity. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So we have a wide range of topics on this show. We have a wide range of guests from lots of different perspectives. And we've only had one other pain expert on the show. And it's a topic that I think really deserves more attention than it gets, not only because of the misconceptions around it, but because of how people can feel really limited by it and to feel really disempowered and sidelined by pain. So I'm really excited to talk to you about your approach and would love to start with some myth busting. If you could maybe take down what we typically think of as pain and why that's flawed, and maybe give us a sense of how we should be thinking about it instead.
One of the biggest problems that we have with pain is not necessarily what people don't know about pain. It's what people think they know but don't know about pain. And what I mean by that is there's these deeply rooted misconceptions about pain and what it is and what it isn't. And it's ubiquitous. It's everyone. I'm almost, the default for me is to recognize when I'm talking to somebody that they probably have some huge misconceptions about pain. And I'm coming from that because of my background. One, I'm a human and we've all experienced pain. So as soon as we experience something, we have a tendency to sort of put it into our mindset and through our schema to make sense of it. So we have these pre-existing beliefs. And then I was trained, so I did go to medical school and I did a fellowship in pain. And then I was an associate program director at the Navy's Pain Medicine Fellowship Program. And I had these very deeply rooted beliefs about what pain were. And because of those belief systems, the way we treat pain follows along those belief systems. So this is a very long-winded way to say that if I just jump directly into that, I'm pretty sure someone out there's hackles are going to arise and they're probably going to stop listening and want to start shouting at however they're listening to the podcast. If you're on your run or whatever, they may stop and get mad at me. So I wanted to put that out there as a caveat that the discussion, when we're talking about belief systems, misconceptions, and pain, I want people to recognize that if you feel a reaction, that's okay. If you're starting to get all wound up, you feel your heart starting to pound and your stomach is starting to bind up and you're like, you want to scream into that microphone, Dr. Cuccaro, you're an absolute idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. One, that's okay. But two, what I would ask you to do is to put a question mark on the end of that so that when you hear me or hear this discussion that takes place, is instead of saying, Dr. Cuccaro, you're an absolute idiot, say, are you an idiot, Dr. Cuccaro, ? Because if you put that question mark on the end, it means that we actually can have a discussion. And then it means that there's going to be some listening that's involved with that. So that's
yeah. Well, the name of the show is A Healthy Curiosity. So it's an opportunity to get curious as to why we might be having that reaction and to perhaps question the lens that we're used to looking through around this issue, because it can be very personal. So, okay, with that caveat.
Well, that's a great place to start then, because with that caveat, we can actually ask, why do we have that visceral reaction when it comes to pain? And a lot of that has to do with what the purpose of pain is. And if you kind of look at our beliefs, and our beliefs sort of drive our behavior, right? That's like the foundation of how we make sense of the world and how then we navigate and how we respond and how we react and preact and everything else like that. Your beliefs about pain are deeply integrated with who you are, because pain in its fundamental, most important aspect of what it is designed to do is it is a protective mechanism designed to keep you safe. And that deeply rooted core belief about safety, then, anytime we start picking around in there, it becomes very, very easy to get a visceral reaction with. And in a way to kind of make an analogy that I would compare this to is your politics. So politics have transitioned over the years until very much we're in this identity land, right? There's people who identify as a conservative or a liberal or this or that, and they think this guy's the greatest and this person's an idiot. And it is so difficult to talk about politics because it is so much wrapped around who our identity is.
Or even your identity around food, right? You're a vegan, or you're like, people really do, like, I'm a coffee drinker, and like, from my cold dead hand will you take this thing that I identify with? And so like, yes to that idea of the identity that becomes rather tribal and rather, like us versus them, or this is a part of how I perceive myself in relation to the outside world.
Absolutely.
So why do we get visceral? And I mean, we all, obviously, visceral comes from the word viscera, right? This idea that it's in our body, we have this experience. And if pain is a protective mechanism, it's useful, right? It's like, it's there to tell us, like, okay, you're burning your hand on the stove, you should maybe take it away now. It's there to prevent us from bodily harm. Why might it stick around, like, past its useful purpose?
I would start there just with the stove. And so really in that scenario, what pain is not doing is saying that, you've burned your hand because you put it on the stove. What pain is doing in that scenario is you might be burning your hand. You might want to pay attention to this to protect yourself. And the reason that differentiation is so important is because in any sort of what we would call acute scenario, we can get into acute and persistent and chronic, all that stuff in a little bit, but acute, which everybody kind of views as easy pain, where the hot stove is a good analogy for, but that even becomes misunderstood, because what pain is trying to do is simply draw attention to create an experience from which that you can do a protective response to. And so touching a hot stove doesn't necessarily mean you've burned yourself. We often have, but once we've burned ourselves in the past, you're more likely to have a experience of pain in a different setting to protect you from burning yourself then. And what I'm basically saying by this is pain protects you by, one, there's some sensations that come up to your body, and those specific type of nerves and what we call nociceptors and nociceptive pathways, but those things are initiated not when damage has been done, but at the threshold or when tissues are in the range of potential damage. And that differentiation is very important, because if pain only occurred if you were damaged, it wouldn't do a great job of protecting you. It would be like a smoke alarm that goes off and only goes off when your house is burning down.
Right. Not so much. You're basically, if I am hearing you correctly, pain is really a signal flare. It's getting the body's and the brain's attention of, like, hey, do something because you're in the danger zone.
Yes, it's a little bit deeper than that, because when you're thinking about an alarm system, right? There is the actual alarm. So a smoke alarm is ringing its noise. And people will sometimes say, well, it's the smoke alarm, that's your pain, right? It's the alarm that's going off. But that alarm, that noise, is not actually pain. It's just what we would call sensory information coming up to your brain. The pain is actually the person that hears that alarm and then what they do next, right? Because if you don't have that person in the room who can hear that alarm and create an experience using not only that alarm information, but that can see what else is occurring, smell what else is occurring, see who else is in that environment. Without that person, there is no pain.
Okay, so pain is in the eye of the beholder.
Pain is an experience that is constructed in the brain from three predominant elements. One of it is sensory information coming from the body. The second is the cognitive element, which is your attention and how you're perceiving events, particularly threat in your general vicinity. And then lastly is the emotion, the affective component, which is based on what your mood state right now, your learning from the past, your memories that are associated with previous incidences. And so pain is the construct of all three of those primary variables that are coming together to construct the experience that you're in right now.
Oh, that makes so much sense to me as an acupuncturist. Um, can I share for a moment just the idea that when I'm talking to patients about the experience of having acupuncture done, people ask, "Does it hurt?" And my response is very much it depends because of those things, right? Like one piece of it is this idea that this tiny filament is being inserted into a point on the body that is a little portal of consciousness that can communicate with our nociceptors or can communicate with our neurotransmitters in a variety of ways. But the idea is like it's getting the body's attention to pay attention to something, but that how people react to that feeling of the arrival of energy at a point, which can feel a little electrical, it can feel a little bit like a current is being engaged. Some people interpret that as terribly painful. And other people are like, ooh, that's interesting. And other people are like, is something going on there? Just that people's interpretation of what is a well, it's at different points have different personalities, but the person's history and the state of their nervous system at the time during a treatment can be hugely varied. So one of the first things I do is encourage people to just whatever the sensation is, especially since an acupuncture needle is 30 of them can fit inside a hypodermic. That it's a very different tool than most of us have encountered in a medical setting or in any setting. Is to run it as sensation. Just run it as like, okay, we're just making contact with your vitality. And a lot of times just framing it that way, giving people a lens to look through whereby it isn't like I'm being assaulted by this metal, tool that there's less anger, there's less outrage, there's less fear, there's less grieving, there's like all the emotions that can come to the surface in response to that suggestion. So anyway, just my little tangent, but that really rings true for me.
It's a great tangent, though, and it's a perfect example of what I call the pain triangle. And so, what the pain triangle is, it's an analogy I use because most people understand fire, right? Or at least on some fundamental principle, they understand that there's more to fire than it doesn't just like pop off of a piece of wood. There's no fire pus, and it's just no fire particles or anything like right. And most of us have been exposed to the fire triangle in either Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts or school somewhere. And what that fire triangle is recognizing that fire is a process. So it's a dynamic process, has a fuel source. But in addition to that fuel source, you have to have oxygen or an oxygen supply, and then you have to have a heat element. And it's only when you have all three of those that you construct a process of fire. And pain is exactly the same, except in a pain triangle, what we have is that sensory aspect, which you perfectly described. It's just the fact sensation, the root characteristics of, is it sharp? Is it dull? Is it pressure-like? Then there is that cognitive heat element, which is the attention. Are you actually observing it? And are you putting a lot of attention there? Or is there something else that you should be paying attention to? And then the oxygen to a pain fire is that emotion that again comes from that learning, memory, mood, the terror. So just, you have somebody that touched that who's got a fear of needles, and you haven't prepped them in such a way, not only are you going to get the sensation of an acupuncture needle, and they're just little hairs, but if you have that thin hair, but you have a lot of heat because now they have some threat associated with it, and then they have a lot of oxygen because you have this massive amount of terror and fear, you can generate a pretty healthy pain fire with something that you would think would be innocuous.
Really, really true. And the idea that it's that Mark Twain quote, I believe, that once a cat jumps onto the hot stove, he's not likely to jump onto a cold one either.
Yes.
Like that idea, the past experience may not be what's recurring in the present moment, but it's our interpretation, it's our association that's the oxygen that you're talking about. That's like what's bringing the heat.
Well, that's the memory and learning association. And that is super, super key because if you look at what pain's purpose is to protect us, and fundamentally, the purpose is to protect us so that we can survive. And so the default for much of our kind of root experiences and our root kind of protective mechanisms that we have are to default to survival, because it makes more sense if you're the cat or if you're whoever if you had that trauma where you've been burned or you jumped on the stove, that in the future that you don't jump immediately, and then you take really careful attention about what this new environment is so that you're protected in the future from a survival standpoint. And we see this over and over and over and over again with pain.
So if we have had a painful experience, Is it enough to just recognize that that past experience might be informing our present? Is there any way that we can overcome that?
It depends on the person. It depends on the pain. It depends on where you are.
Yeah.
There's highly complex pain fires, just like there's highly complex fires. There's easier fires, but even an easy fire can be difficult to put out depending on the scenario. And a complex fire, if you got people who really know what they're doing or you have the right resources there, those can be put out pretty quick. So it really depends on a lot of different inputs. But I guess the key part about that is when you understand pain, and this is like the big thing for me, is when we start talking about pain and we start actually coming from it with an open mindset, a curiosity approach, where we're saying we don't know everything anymore. Like all those past experiences, let's forget them and start from a blank state and just open with a piece of curiosity. There is so much more hope when it comes to helping people with pain. There's so much more help, so much opportunity, and there's lives that can be transformed. But you have to start at that foundation and really understanding the pain part and be willing to start teasing out these elements and seeing all the things that are involved in constructing that individual pain. Because once we do that, man, it just opens up all sorts of variables and all sorts of avenues. And I don't want to ever say that it's easy, but it simplifies the process, and at least we know where we're going, rather than doing the grab bag approach, just throw everything against the throw the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks, which is the typical healthcare approach to pain right now.
When you think about people who are dealing with chronic pain, I mean, I can think about people who regularly come to see me for things like fibromyalgia flare-ups, or, like pain that they don't necessarily know what the root cause is, but they know that certain things make it worse. And while acupuncture can do a great job at helping to calm it down, but it'll come back if that person is in a similar situation. For something like that, where you don't necessarily know, is it a virus? Is it toxic load of something? Is it that there's something going on in the body such that there is an inflammation response that kicks up every once in a while and causes fairly generalized, fairly uncomfortable sensation? Are there things that people can do that like they're not already doing in terms of like taking a painkiller or getting acupuncture or like getting curious about what's going on underneath? That are those people missing anything that could help them?
The short answer would be yes.
Mm-hmm.
But the longer answer, it would come to, we would go into the details of like, I don't like the word cause anymore when it comes to pain, because that typically leads people to use the language of, well, my pain is coming from. And the problem with that is that if we start saying or labeling a single thing as a quote unquote source of pain, we are implicating that there are pain particles or there's this pain stuff that oozes out of typically a structure. So what I mean by that is if you break your leg, you have a femur fracture, that's a big bone, takes a lot of force, but it breaks. If your leg hurts, the pain is not coming from that leg. That is not what we would call the cause of the pain per se. What it is it's providing sensory information up to the brain, and then you still have to have those other two elements. And the importance of that is, I see a lot of people running around trying to find quote unquote causes for pain. But when you start moving outside of the realm, when we have what I would call a heavy fuel fire, like a broken leg, or if someone has, a burn, or they've just had an operation, it starts to be a great confounder, because people bring up this stuff about, well, chronic inflammation, that's where the cause of the pain is. But then they forget there's a bunch of people running around with chronic inflammation that don't have any pain. So we can't say that's the source or cause. There has to be something more there. And so I think it's really coming to, and again, this is not easy to do to start. I've been doing it for a number of years, so my brain just thinks this way. But start thinking of pain in that constructed format of, hey, what's the sensory element? So if someone has inflammation, and say it's a local inflammation because they have a burn, that local inflammatory response would be, well, this is it's a hot, sharp, pressure-like sensation, right? But that's not the source, that's just the sensation. Then they're involved, you have to look at, well, how do I view it? Am I viewing it as, oh my God, I burned my hand, how stupid I am, and this was so dumb, and what if I scar, or I don't have enough health insurance? Then we're adding in that cognitive element, then the meaning that's associated with it. Oh, the last time I burned my hand, I don't know, I was out of work for 6 months, or the last time I burned my hand was, here's a horrible example. Last time I had a burn like hand was because my abusive parent stuck my hand to a hot stove. But when we start pulling out all those individual variables there, it makes a more dynamic approach to understanding pain. When we just think of simple cause and effect scenarios, we start not seeing things that are often right in front of us that can be very helpful. If we're only talking about sensation, so you mentioned acupuncture and people going in for acupuncture, and oftentimes what we've done is altering that experience, i.e. pain, in that moment in time, because we've changed sort of that sensory aspect. By the words that we've said, we've actually changed the heat, that cognitive aspect. And then there may be an association with that oxygen element as too. If they have a trusting relationship with you, they feel safe, you have a safe therapeutic relationship. But until we actually start unearthing and talking about those heat and oxygen variables, if we're only focusing on the sensation itself, we're kind of priming ourselves to flare. You can kind of view pain again as there can be environments where you have so much heat and so much air, hot, dry environments, where you can have these little sparks, which you can have a flare of pain with. And we may put out that individual fire because we can maybe take away the fuels first for that. But if we haven't really targeted that heat and oxygen, we haven't really prevented an environment of future pain scenarios. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I'm struck by how mindfulness training could be hugely impactful for people with chronic pain, because you can help people separate out which are simply the pure sensation from all of the emotion and association and history and identity that gets layered on to pain. I can think about and I can think about times in my life where that's absolutely been true, where if I just come back to what's happening now, what's going on, irrespective of what it means, what I think it might have to mean, the pain level goes down significantly.
Awareness and mindfulness is a great way to increase your level of awareness, is absolutely key. Because the other challenging aspect about pain is when you are in that experience, the ability to think becomes impaired. We become much more reactionary, depending on how long we've experienced it, depending on other factors in our histories and lives. That automatic pathway becomes evoked, and without being able to separate ourselves and sort of rise above and look down, like a meta approach, right? We kind of separate ourselves from that, pull ourselves out of the experience, and then look down. That's the only way that we can start seeing those contributors, and that we can start addressing those contributors in a more effective fashion. So absolutely, mindfulness and any sort of awareness technique is so powerful.
And the fact too that pain doesn't necessarily mean tissue damage is, I think, a really important point. That there is, just because it hurts doesn't mean that there's a physical problem to be solved. And also, very real physical problems don't have to hurt. Like they're both can be true.
If you only take one thing away from this particular discussion, if people start moving away from the idea that pain equals punishment, i.e. pain equals damage, and simply start thinking or understanding that pain is a protector, right there, that changes our relationship with pain. Because a protector is trying to do something good for you. And you can have protectors. I mean, if you're in a scenario where you have a over-aggressive bodyguard and maybe he hears someone open up a can of pop and hears a pop and he throws you against the wall because he thinks it's a gunshot, that may not be a great moment in time for you, but they were still trying to protect you. Maybe they were overreacting in that scenario, but it isn't like, oh my God, this guy's throwing me against the wall because he wants to hurt me and he hates me and kind of drag us farther and farther down into that rabbit hole where we feel that there's no hope. So just understanding pain is a protector is key. Because then the second part of that is we start asking, well, what is it trying to protect me from? And once we start looking away from strictly physical structures or physical processes and start understanding that threats can come from your environment, that can come from your relationships, that can come from your history of trauma, and now it's trying to protect you now because maybe there is a new person that is fairly traumatic in your life, workplace dynamics, financial stressors are threats. Once we can start, we never ignore the body and all of this stuff. Never ignore the body. But once you understand that pain is a protector, you can start looking beyond the body when it doesn't seem to be a significant, or dangerous bodily process that's involved right now.
If you've got a healthy curiosity, you want to know how you can be doing right by your body and how to live a more mindful, streamlined life in accordance with your values. While I love that you tune into the show every week, are you taking action? If not, why not? Here are the top 3 roadblocks that could be holding you back. 1, thinking that knowing is doing. They're different things. Knowing the properties of herbs is different than actually taking them. Knowing how to change a habit is different than actually changing up your routine. Knowing is the first step, but the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 100th steps involve action. Number 2, thinking that because you're smart and used to being successful, that you need to do it all yourself. This one dogged me for years as an independent-minded overachiever. That is, until I realized that 1, I can't see my own blind spots, and 2, I don't know what I don't know. Now, I'd much rather work with a guide who can point out the shortcut for the path I want to travel rather than get lost in the woods alone. Not only is it way easier, but I'm more likely to show up for myself if I've told my coach or my mastermind partners what I'm trying to do. Reason number 3, thinking that you don't have the money. What we spend money on is a reflection of what we're prioritizing. Maybe it's time to prioritize you. I'm opening up my calendar for a handful of one-on-one coaching clients. I've helped thousands of women break up with stress, optimize their habits, mood, hormones, weight, and vitality with integrative body-mind tools from Chinese medicine, yoga, neuroscience, coaching, and ancient wisdom. Just as importantly, I pour my heart into each of my clients, and you will feel that love in every single interaction. If you're ready to feel more calm and confident in your own skin, start feeling younger every year, feeling like you're at the center of your own life rather than just getting through it, and feel loved and supported in the process, head over to the Work With Me page at brodywelch.com and apply to work with me one-on-one. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. Now back to the show. I love that you went there. I have 2 responses, 2 things that are coming up for me. The first is the fact that I've had lower back pain since I was a teenager. And I can point to very real things that have shown up on x-rays, and I can point to very real injuries that I sustained as a gymnastics coach, as a teenager, and as a gymnast and all that. But when I was in acupuncture school and working as a massage therapist in my early 20s, I had the back pain was so bad that I would sometimes seize up and almost fall on my clients. But then I would go away for the weekends and my back wouldn't hurt at all. And as soon as I got back into town and opened the door to where I lived, the pain would come back. And I was like, oh, is how, my attitude, how the amount of time compression, the fact that I had zero, I was working like crazy hours and my life was so difficult, stressful, and really, I was driving myself into the ground at the time that literally nothing physically could have changed that much in a 24-hour period or in a 5-second period of stepping back home. But my experience of my back was radically different. That was the first time where I really understood in such stark terms how my back was a signal that I was doing too much, that I was overworking.
It's trying to protect you from something.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the idea that the feeling like my life itself is an impossible threat was pretty tough to live with. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is the definition of pain from a Chinese medicine perspective. And in Chinese medicine, we associate the liver and with capital L liver as having to do with the free and easy flow of qi in the body and the free and easy flow of emotions in the body. And the flow of blood or anything physical fluids follows the free flow of qi. But it's an axiom in Chinese medicine that where there is pain, there is no free flow of qi, of life force. And where there is pain, there is no free flow. And where there is free flow, there is no pain. And so this idea of the unencumbered movement of consciousness around our physical being, when that is happening smoothly, then we're pain-free. And the idea that blood, which contains our emotions and our identity, blood with a capital B, when qi stagnates long enough, we get blood stagnation. And blood stagnation can be a hardening of our ego around who we think we need to be, a hardening of our psyche. And so therefore, we perceive a lot more threats in the world. We can go to a place of feeling like we need to protect and therefore might experience more pain, the more rigid we are in what might threaten our sense of who we need to be in the world in order to keep ourselves safe.
Now, rigidity is bad.
Yes.
You want to be soft when you need to be soft. You need to be hard when you need to be hard. But really, be able to be flexible is key, right? So where you can go between.
Absolutely.
It is interesting, but it's just, I guess that's what's really kind of key there. When we start questioning pain, again, start questioning these root assumptions, and we start understanding and appreciating what it's doing, it just changes the relationship you have. And again, this is why I don't like to distinguish things between acute and chronic anymore, or persistent is the word that we now, because pain is pain. All pain is pain. The only difference is all fires are fire. The only difference in a fire is not the fundamentals, how it's constructed. It's what the individual contributors are in that particular fire, in that moment in time, in that space. And pain's the same. People think, well, acute pain, again, is easy and we don't need to talk about it. Well, the same principles, if you understand pain well and you understand the principles of how it's constructed, those principles are universal, and you can apply them in an acute pain scenario, i.e. you sprain your ankle or actually have physical harm or not. And we can use them in a persistent pain scenario where people may have had pain for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. One of our community members here, so I do a lot of work mostly with healthcare clinicians now teaching about pain. And so I'm so proud actually of the people I've worked with, because then I get to hear what their students have learned. We have a woman in our community who is 74 years old. She's had pain since she was 14 years old. She went through one of my colleagues' programs here. And it's not just her pain that is transformed, it's her entire life is transformed, because it brought it into awareness all these contributors that had been placed since she was earlier in her life. And now, because she kind of understands how all this stuff fits, the life she has now is one that she couldn't even have imagined. And you wouldn't find that without really kind of recognizing how any experience, but in particular, pain is an experience that's constructed. And once you can appreciate it, look beyond just the physical, amazing things can occur.
That's so inspiring to understand that if we can construct it, we can deconstruct it or reconstruct it.
Absolutely. It is the deconstruction becomes key, and that's where the awareness comes in. But the ability to do that means you have to be able to question and to look at it without judgment anymore. There's a lot of judgment and shame and anger and guilt and rage and injustice that can sometimes be wrapped up within our own pain. We have to be willing to start facing trauma. There's people that have had really horrible things that have occurred. There's certain scenarios where I'll hear a couple of words and the first thing I think of is, well, where's the trauma? What happened to them in the past? And some people don't want to talk about that, or they don't want to approach about it and they think, well, I've buried that. That doesn't matter now. Well, you haven't buried that. Your brain is always going to be kind of using that as a potential lens through which to see threat and uncertainty. And if we're not recognizing that, we just aren't going to be able to heal effectively.
And it's not weakness to have experienced trauma. It's just part of our history, and our bodies are doing the best that it can to keep us safe in the present. And so recognizing again that pain is our ally.
Yeah, it is definitely not weakness, it's strength, just like you're saying. And so, if I'm doing more of a talk and presentation about pain and we start talking about the risk factors, because the risk factors associated with persistent pain are pretty well known and teased out. There's quite a few of them. But the root of almost all of them is early life stress and trauma. And this can be framed in very bad ways, which can affect really people's development. Because if people are told, well, you experienced all this trauma in the past and now you're broken, and now we're going to say that you have central sensitization and you have a brain that's overreacting now because it's had all this trauma. Well, now you think you're permanently broken.
Right. You feel like a victim. You feel like, okay, well, shit, that ship has sailed. I can't turn back the clock.
Yeah. Well, what am I going to do now? And that's a very valid complaint. But if you, again, that's pain as a punisher kind of mindset. But if we understand pain is trying to protect you, and then we have to kind of go back in time and go, well, how was it protecting us? Because pain protects us in the moment in time, in the now. But the best way that pain protects us is in the future, by using those memories and past experiences in order to flavor and construct our experiences in the now. Well, in those moments of time, if you have someone who's being subjected to early life stress, first of all, neural development is at its peak. And we can include in utero exposure. So the babies in the fetus that are exposed to a mother who's under high amounts of distress. That's distress, not eustress per se, because there's different types of stresses. But high amounts of distress in utero, the brain starts to change. The way it starts processing information starts to change. And when that continues through, or it starts in childhood, it's the same thing. The way I would explain it, though, is why is it changing? Because the way it seems to change, again, the purpose, your brain's primary purpose is to make sense of the world and keep you alive to survive. And from a survival-based standpoint, it makes more sense to see threat than not. And so when we have people who have gone under a significant amount of stress, early life stress, or even any sort of massive stressor, the brain is going to want to protect you in the future. And so it takes that information and says, I'm going to see a lot of stress now because the last time I didn't see stress, bad things occurred. So this is a horrible example, but if you were a child that was in an abusive environment and you didn't know whether the knock or the door turning in the middle of the night was your mom coming home from her midnight shift to give you a kiss goodnight, or it was your abuser coming into your room because they knew your mom was away, the default of the brain in that scenario and the way it's going to practice and develop is going to default to this is a threat. Because it's much easier to back away from a threat than it is to sort of react if we need to in the future. And in that scenario, then you understand that all your brain has been trying to do since the time that you were small is to protect you. And so that past traumatic experience in the now is still trying to protect you as best it can. And that, again, that's a different relationship that we have with our brains, is when you recognize that these stuff occurs and yeah, it's not pleasant and it's not wonderful, but it's coming from a sense of love and appreciation because your brain is doing the best it can with the information that it has based on the experiences it had in the past. That is much different than thinking that you're permanently broken.
Absolutely, right? On the contrary, you're very functional. You're still functional. You're a survivor, yeah. and your body is still, or you're reacting in such a way as to enable your survival. For that person that you're just describing, what are the most important steps that he or she can take now, recognizing, okay, this happened, and I do want to change my associations with this trigger, for example?
Well, this depends on the individual again, because if we start getting into some really heavy duty stress and trauma, it's probably best to have someone who has a trauma background working with you.
Yes.
And so I just want to throw that caveat. For other people, though, who are kind of struggling with it, I would start with what past experiences, when did your pain start? Now, in a typical medical practice, and I used to do this, is people will come in and they'll often want to tell the narrative of their pain. And they'll start, say they're 50 years old, and they'll start with a story when they're 16. And in most medical offices, and again, I used to do this, so and I apologize in advance if it was anybody I saw in the past, but we would say, well, no, I just want to hear about this episode in the now. But all that information, all that from that lengthy history becomes useful. So write it down. Take a moment in time and just write out your pain story from the beginning. Not 2 days ago, 3 days ago, but if you were going to walk into someone's office and they said, well, when did your pain start? And you're 70 and you want to start at 14, that's where your story starts.
That's really honoring the narrative of where it came from.
Honoring and recognizing the narrative. And then the key with that, though, is to see those parts that have occurred, but recognize that your story is never completely written. We can always change how the next chapter is going to be by utilizing that information that came before. Writing is super powerful, and just starting that part where you start writing at the beginning, you'll often see associations that you didn't recognize. You'll see anchors that you didn't see before. You'll see recurrence and patterns that you may not have appreciated. So that's probably the place where I would start.
Wonderful. I love that. I really appreciate the concrete and practical first steps that people listening can take if this applies to them, because it is not something that really we are, from a Chinese medicine standpoint, we are ecosystems and we're dynamic and we're changing all the time. And the mind-body connection is real, and our ability to interpret our life experience in a way that serves us and that adds to our energy, that frees the flow of qi as opposed to obstructs it and reinforces a stagnation, is ultimately how we create health.
I would add on to it is however you write your story, and this ultimately chooses into how you, I don't like the word treatment, because we don't treat pain, we facilitate change for pain. If you're looking at your story, you always want to make sure that it's an empowering story and not an entrapping story. And the other part that you kind of touched on a little bit too is a lot of this comes down to the individual and what they do. Now, if you got a good practitioner or someone you're working with, they can facilitate and help you to change and guide you and provide the questions maybe in a Socratic fashion to really sort of work with you through that. But the work is it depends on you being involved. And so the more you can start being active and involved in your care and start looking who you can work with or what you can do for yourself and those the steps that you can take, rather than looking on the outside for the magic bullet or that someone else has to be the only person that can do anything for your pain. That change, when you start taking that mindset and sort of that active and engaged mindset, and again, it can be very challenging, that's where a lot of the great changes occur.
So true. And that's actually one of the things that lights me up about doing Chinese medicine, doing acupuncture with people, is that we get to engage the story, we get to engage the history. People can hone an intention, and then there's, for every aspect of life experience, there's a point that resonates with that. And so then it's like we can strike a chord on the body, that playing different points in concert with one another that send a particular message, which can encourage energy to flow differently, which can encourage the brain to file something in a different folder, so to speak, and can change our associations and really allow us to show up differently in the world. So there is this there's this body mind component that has very much to do with intentionality, but that also is really richly woven into the fabric of Chinese medicine, in which the psycho-spiritual level of programming stuff, where there's a whole set of meridians that work with that called the extraordinary vessels, that is one of my favorite things to work with, and often in conjunction with someone who's undergoing psychotherapy and working on the cognitive aspects of it there, but working on the changing the relationship in their physiology in real time. It can be really exciting and fun. So just throwing that in there as a point of information for people listening who may not think of Chinese medicine as something that can affect both our physiology, as well as our associations and our story.
There's a couple things also that are important with this, is because from a therapeutic standpoint, if you are the practitioner, the more you view yourself as a fixer, the more you're entrapping your patient to you.
Right. The more dependent
and a lot of times that occurs through passive-based modalities. And so passive-based modalities would be injections, drugs, surgeries, but they also would include things such as massage or acupuncture and things like that. And the reason I want to bring that up is sometimes people will say just because something is alternative that it's better. And it may not be as risky as, say, a multi-level fusion or a cervical epidural steroid injection. But we can frame any sort of passive-based therapy as that the magic comes from the therapy per se.
Sure, right.
And then what we've done, and it's great for business, The more you entrap people to you, that's better for business, but it isn't as helpful for our patients. And so if you're a practitioner, really help encourage people to start, instead of thinking that you're a fixer or you fix things, is how can you facilitate change with your client? How can you empower your client? And again, I'm not a huge fan of passive-based modalities, but if you're using them, how can you use a passive-based treatment modality as a bridge to getting your patient active rather than a tool that entraps them to you? Right? So how can you give it
such an important point, right? It's like, how can we make people as independent from practitioners as possible? And that to me is the whole educational branch of what it is I do, and why the focus of my work has shifted from the clinical setting to more the coaching setting, and bringing people together to actually implement the things that I used to just write down on a prescription pad, but actually to be taking action and to be bridging the gap between what we know we want to be doing to take care of ourselves and actually doing it, because really we are our own healers.
We need more of a coaching mindset in any given healthcare scenario. I kind of use the example of there's genie care and there's coach care. And unfortunately, much of the healthcare system, and again, this can bleed out into whatever type of health environment you're in, is based on genie care. The unfortunate thing, though, is if you kind of go back to the stories about what genies do, and I'm like, well, what are genies? And they go, first of all, they're mythological creatures. But the other thing is they granted wishes. And the downstream effects of getting those wishes typically had very bad consequences for the individual. The stories were not necessarily happy. If you kind of go back to the story of, you ever heard the story of the monkey's paw and the wishes that are associated with that? That kind of genie care is not what particularly for any sort of chronic condition that's been around for a long time. Now, if you have a broken leg, hey, I want a genie who goes in there and puts a fixator in it and stabilizes it. But for the experience, I want a coach. And for most healthcare, you want more of a coach-based care, because what do coaches do? They work with you to identify your key issues, to facilitate change in the individual and empower them through the process. That is universal. that can be applied in any sort of clinical setting. Anybody can use that, but it's a lot different than what we were taught. And it's more challenging in a lot of ways because now you have to recognize there's a dynamic and it's no longer just about you, i.e. the practitioner anymore. You can't pretend that you have, that you have magic hands. You have to actually you have a magic relationship, and how can you foster those magic relationships?
Well, and that too is that as a patient, if you're working with a practitioner who is not interested in empowering you, listening to you, working with you, enabling there to be synergy between like meeting you where you're at and then enabling you to take a next step, that you might not be getting the best care you possibly could.
Yes. Outside of, I'm just going to put this out there, just because of emergency scenarios.
Exactly. Yes. Right.
Because if you disagree, if you're having an acute heart attack and you've got a big old embolus in a major coronary artery.
Yeah, don't let somebody coach you through that.
No. And your interventional cardiologist may be the biggest jerk in the world.
Doesn't really matter.
Get the block out. Now, when it's all said and done, and you want actually real healing after you've gone through that acute scenario, then you want to get someone you can work with. Because it's a different sort of relationship, different environment. Ultimately, is more important. But in those, again, acute care, and I just want to say that because you always hear these horrible stories about people walking into the ER and then they want to have long discussions. And I'm never saying don't talk, but if you're having an acute event where you're bleeding out all over the floor, what you really need is just to get that addressed.
Exactly right. That's a time for the do me model of medicine, and then you can be engaged in the healing process after that. Well, Dr. Cuccaro, you've been really generous with your time and information. I so appreciate being able to have this chat with you, especially not knowing very much about your work, but being intrigued through our mutual friend and colleague. So glad to have been able to chat with you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I hope everybody out there got something useful out of this and got a little bit more curious about pain.
Me too. And just a reminder, if people are interested in learning more about pain, that they can visit you, or they can get thepainclass.com. Is that the best place to reach out and connect with you as well?
It's probably the best to hear about pain related things. And I will just kind of put the caveat that is, I use wording in there so it's a little bit more clinically minded. So people who have a healthcare background, just kind of make sure people are aware of it. I've had people who have not had healthcare go through that particular class and program, but I just want to put that caveat because I do use a couple complex terms in there.
Well, thanks so much. I'll make sure that gets into the show notes.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening today. For more episodes of A Healthy Curiosity, you can visit the iTunes store. If you appreciated today's show, please leave us a review. This helps other people to find the podcast. You could also head to brodywelch.com, where you can find free self-care resources, learn more about Chinese medicine, and let me know what you'd like to hear about on future episodes. I'd love to hear from you. Till next time, be good to yourself.